You are the sky, the storms will pass. There is a truth that 99% of us never realize. Right now, in this very moment, you are perfect exactly as you are. You didn't come here by accident. Perhaps a part of you is searching for peace. If that's true, please subscribe to Whispers of Dharma and watch this entire video. Because every day, this place has stories created specifically for your soul. Today, I will tell you about a man named Robert who lost everything. Lost his job, lost his home, even lost his faith. But in his darkest moment, he discovered something that every millionaire craves but cannot buy. And this story will change how you see every difficulty in your life. But before we begin, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like the entire world was turning its back on you? If yes, please type the number 1 in the comments. Robert Williams was 52 years old and had been teaching elementary school for 28 years in a small town outside London. With his silver white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, his students called him Mr. Robert with such warm affection. Every morning he arrived early to prepare his lessons, caring for each student as if they were his own children. But then, life began its darkest chapter for Robert. First, his wife Sarah, also a beloved teacher and his companion for 25 years, suddenly passed away in a car accident. The death of his life partner struck like lightning from a clear sky. Robert sat beside her coffin through the entire night, not crying, just staring and whispering, "How could you leave me alone like this?" Before he could recover from losing his wife, Robert received the second devastating news. His only son, Michael, fresh out of university, suffered a severe motorcycle accident. After 3 months in the hospital, doctors announced that Michael would be confined to a wheelchair for life. The medical costs and special care expenses financially destroyed the family. As if fate wasn't cruel enough, Robert discovered he had early-stage cancer. The chemotherapy treatments left him weak and unable to continue teaching. The school, citing budget cuts, had to let him take early retirement with minimal pension. Let me ask you something. What do you think Robert will do in this situation? Please share your prediction in the comments. The months that followed turned Robert into a ghost wandering through life. His small house fell silent, empty of laughter. His son sank into depression while Robert drowned in mounting medical bills. There were nights when he sat alone in the kitchen, staring at their old wedding photo, asking himself, "Am I even worth living?" One morning, while waiting for chemotherapy at the hospital, Robert met an 8-year-old boy named Tommy. The boy also had cancer, his head completely bald, but his eyes still shone brightly. Tommy asked him, "Are you sad, sir? Do you know why I'm not sad?" Robert shook his head. Tommy smiled. "Because my mom told me I'm like the sky. Dark clouds might cover me for a while, but I'm still there. Still blue, still vast. Sickness is just clouds, sir." Those words struck like lightning. Robert began to see his life differently. He remembered his 28 years in the classroom. How many students had passed through his hands? How many had succeeded in life? He recalled thank you letters from parents, visits from former students. From that moment, Robert began to change his perspective. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, he decided to teach underprivileged children for free in his neighborhood. His small living room became a classroom. Every afternoon, children's laughter filled the air, replacing the empty silence. Robert also started keeping a journal, writing down positive thoughts each day. Though his body was weak from chemotherapy, he still tried to exercise gently and meditate for 15 minutes every morning. Some people might say Robert is deceiving himself by thinking positively. Do you agree? Please share your opinion in the comments. 6 months later, something miraculous happened. Test results showed Robert's tumor had significantly shrunk. Doctors couldn't explain why, but Robert knew. When the soul finds peace, the body heals too. His son Michael, seeing his father's transformation, also began to find motivation again. He learned graphic design, worked from home, and gradually built a stable income. Robert's free classes grew larger every day. Many parents volunteered donations, giving Robert additional small income. More importantly, he found new meaning in life. 2 years later, a local journalist wrote about this special classroom. Robert's story spread widely. Many schools invited him to share his experiences. He became an inspiration for countless people facing difficulties. During one speaking event, Robert said, "I once thought I was a victim of fate, but now I understand I am not the storm, I am the sky. The storm only passes through, while I remain forever vast." What moved you most about this story? And do you believe everyone can change how they view difficulties? The story of Robert Williams. A teacher's journey through darkness to light. Robert Williams had always believed that good people were rewarded with good lives. For 28 years, he had dedicated his heart and soul to teaching children in the small town of Millbrook, just outside London. His classroom wasn't just a place of learning. It was a sanctuary where struggling students found hope, where shy children discovered their voices, and where every child felt valued. Sarah, his wife, taught in the same school. They were known as the golden couple of education. Together, they had transformed countless young lives. Their own son, Michael, had grown into a brilliant young man studying computer science at Cambridge University. Life seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But fate has a way of testing those who shine brightest. It was a Tuesday evening in November when Sarah called Robert from her car. She was driving home from a parent-teacher conference, her voice bright with excitement about a breakthrough with one of her struggling students. 10 minutes later, Robert received a call that shattered his world. A drunk driver had run a red light. Sarah's car was hit directly on the driver's side. She died instantly. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Former students, now adults, flew in from across the country. Parents whose children Sarah had taught decades ago came to pay their respects. As Robert stood at the podium to deliver his eulogy, he looked out at the sea of faces and realized something profound. Sarah's influence had rippled through generations, but that realization couldn't fill the emptiness in his heart. For weeks, Robert moved through life like a sleepwalker. He would set 2 plates for dinner, then remember. He would reach for the phone to call Sarah about something funny that happened at school, then remember. The house felt impossibly large and overwhelmingly quiet. Just as Robert was beginning to find small moments of peace in his memories of Sarah, life delivered another crushing blow. Michael, home for Christmas break, decided to visit a friend across town on his motorcycle. It was a crisp December morning, the roads slick with frost. A delivery truck driver, rushing to complete his route, didn't see the motorcycle until it was too late. The accident left Michael paralyzed from the waist down. As Robert sat in the hospital corridor, watching doctors rush in and out of his son's room, he felt something inside him break that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The vibrant young man who had run marathons, who had dreamed of traveling the world after graduation, would now spend his life in a wheelchair. The medical bills began arriving like a relentless tide. Physical therapy, specialized equipment, home modifications to accommodate Michael's wheelchair. Robert's teacher's salary, which had always been modest, was quickly overwhelmed. He took out loans against his house, emptied his retirement savings, and still the bills kept coming. Then came the third blow. During a routine checkup, doctors found a suspicious mass in Robert's chest. The word cancer hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Early stage, they said. Treatable, they said. But the chemotherapy would be aggressive, and he would likely be too weak to continue teaching. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, had been Robert's friend for 15 years. When she called him into her office to discuss early retirement, tears filled her eyes. Budget cuts, she explained. They couldn't hold his position open indefinitely. The early retirement package was minimal, barely enough to cover basic living expenses. Robert walked out of that office feeling like he had lost not just his job, but his identity. Who was he if not a teacher? What was his purpose if not to shape young minds? The chemotherapy began in February. The treatments left Robert violently ill, his once thick silver hair falling out in clumps. Michael, struggling with his own depression, retreated into his room for days at a time. The house that had once been filled with laughter and dinner table conversations fell into a heavy silence. There were moments, sitting alone in his bedroom at 3 a.m, when Robert wondered if it would be easier to just give up. The insurance money from Sarah's death would ensure Michael was cared for. What was the point of fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win? It was during one of these dark moments that Robert found Sarah's journal. She had kept it hidden in her bedside drawer, filling it with thoughts about her students, her hopes for Michael's future, and her deep love for Robert. One entry, written just weeks before her death, stopped him cold. I watched Robert today with little Emma, the girl who barely speaks in class. He spent his entire lunch break just sitting with her, not pushing her to talk, just being present. He doesn't see what I see. He doesn't understand that he's not just teaching reading and math. He's teaching these children how to be human, how to show kindness when the world is cruel, how to find light in darkness. If something ever happens to me, I hope he remembers that his greatest gift isn't his knowledge, it's his heart. Robert read those words again and again, tears streaming down his face. Sarah had seen something in him that he had forgotten. Even in his current broken state, that gift remained. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in the hospital waiting room. Robert was there for his weekly blood test, feeling nauseous and exhausted from the latest round of chemotherapy. Across from him sat a young mother with her 8-year-old son, Tommy. The boy was clearly undergoing treatment too, his head completely bald, a port visible in his chest where medications were administered. But Tommy was smiling, actually smiling. He was drawing pictures and showing them to other patients in the waiting room, making up elaborate stories about dragons and princesses. When he approached Robert with a drawing of a bright blue sky dotted with white clouds, Robert felt compelled to ask, "How do you stay so happy, Tommy? Aren't you scared?" Tommy looked at him with the profound wisdom that sometimes emerges from young souls who have faced too much too soon. "My mom told me something," Tommy said, glancing at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "She said I'm like the sky. You know how sometimes there are really dark, scary clouds that cover up the whole sky? And you might think the sky is gone, that it's all just darkness? But the sky is still there, behind all those clouds. And when the storm passes, the sky is still blue, still beautiful, still endless." Tommy handed Robert the drawing. "The cancer is just clouds, mister. You're still the sky." That simple wisdom from an 8-year-old child changed everything for Robert. He began to see his situation differently. Yes, he had lost Sarah, but the love they shared had created 25 years of beautiful memories. Yes, Michael was in a wheelchair, but he was alive, brilliant, and capable of creating a meaningful life. Yes, Robert had cancer, but he was still here, still breathing, still capable of making a difference. That afternoon, Robert made a decision that would transform not just his own life, but the lives of countless others. He would start teaching again, not in a school, but in his own living room. He would offer free tutoring to children whose families couldn't afford extra help. Within weeks, word spread through the community. The legendary Mr. Williams was teaching again. Parents began bringing their children to his small house. Some came for academic help, others because their children were struggling with confidence or social skills. Robert approached each child the same way he always had, with patience, kindness, and the unwavering belief that every child had something special to offer the world. As autumn arrived, something miraculous began to happen. Robert's energy slowly returned. The house filled with children's laughter once again. Michael, inspired by his father's resilience, began learning web design and slowly started building an online business from his bedroom. The quarterly cancer checkup brought news that stunned the doctors. The tumor had shrunk significantly, far more than expected at this stage of treatment. When the oncologist asked if Robert had made any major lifestyle changes, Robert simply smiled and said, "I remembered who I am." 2 years later, a local newspaper reporter heard about the retired teacher who was running a free school from his living room. The article she wrote was picked up by national media. Soon, Robert was invited to speak at education conferences, sharing his story of how loss had led to a deeper understanding of purpose. During one such speaking engagement, a principal from an inner-city school approached Robert with a proposition. Would he consider returning to formal teaching, leading a program for at-risk students? The salary was modest, but the opportunity to work with children who needed him most was irresistible. On his first day back in a real classroom, Robert looked out at a room full of skeptical teenagers, many of whom had been written off by the education system. He thought of Sarah, of Tommy in the hospital, of all the children who had passed through his living room classroom. "I want to tell you something," he said to those students. "You are not your circumstances. You are not your struggles. You are not the labels that others have put on you. You are the sky. And no matter how dark the clouds get, the sky is always there, always vast, always full of infinite possibility." Robert Williams had learned that sometimes we must lose everything to discover who we truly are. And sometimes the greatest teachers are those who have learned to find light in the deepest darkness. The profound lessons from Robert's journey. Buddhist wisdom for modern life. Robert Williams' story is not just a touching tale of resilience. It is a living illustration of the deepest teachings found in Buddhist philosophy about the nature of suffering and the path to liberation. When we examine Robert's journey through the lens of ancient wisdom, we discover timeless truths that can transform how we understand our own struggles. The Four Noble Truths and life's reality. The Buddha taught in the Four Noble Truths that suffering is an inevitable part of existence. The first truth, dukkha, acknowledges that life contains pain, loss, illness, aging, and death. Robert experienced the full spectrum of what Buddha called the suffering of change. He lost his beloved wife, watched his son become paralyzed, faced his own cancer diagnosis, and lost his career identity. But here lies the crucial insight. The Buddha's teaching was not that we should expect only suffering, but that we should understand its true nature. In the middle-length discourses, Buddha taught this profound lesson. When hit by the first arrow of actual pain or loss, most people immediately shoot themselves with a second arrow of mental anguish, worry, and despair. The wise person accepts the first arrow but refuses to shoot the second. Robert initially shot himself with countless second arrows. He added layers of self-pity, hopelessness, and victim mentality to his actual losses. But when young Tommy shared his sky metaphor, Robert learned to stop shooting those additional arrows of mental suffering. Let me ask you this. When difficulty strikes your life, do you focus on the actual challenge? Or do you multiply your pain with worry about the future and regret about the past? Share your honest reflection in the comments. The teaching of no self and the nature of identity. One of Buddhism's most revolutionary insights is the doctrine of anatta, or no self. This doesn't mean we don't exist, but that there is no fixed, unchanging essence that defines who we are. In the Diamond Sutra, Buddha taught that all conditioned phenomena are like dreams, illusions, bubbles, shadows, dew, or lightning. We should contemplate them in this way. Robert had built his identity around being a successful teacher, a loving husband, and a strong father. When these roles were stripped away, he felt as though he had lost himself entirely. But this crisis of identity became his greatest teacher. He discovered that he was not merely these temporary roles and circumstances. The realization that he was like the sky, vast and unchanging beneath the temporary clouds of circumstance, reflects the Buddhist understanding of our true nature. We are not our job titles, our relationships, our health status, or our current problems. These are temporary conditions passing through the space of our awareness. This is beautifully expressed in the Heart Sutra's teaching on emptiness. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Robert's suffering was real, but it was also empty of permanent substance. When he understood this, he found freedom even in the midst of difficulty. Now let me challenge your thinking. Some people argue that accepting suffering as natural makes us passive and prevents us from trying to improve our situation. What do you think? Does understanding the temporary nature of problems make us weaker or stronger? Please share your perspective. The law of karma and the power of mind Buddhism teaches that everything arises from mind. Mind is the forerunner. Mind is supreme. The opening verse of the Dhammapada states that if one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never leaves. Robert proved this teaching through his own transformation. When he changed his perspective from victim to teacher, from helpless to helpful, everything in his external world began to shift. His health improved, his relationship with Michael strengthened, and new opportunities emerged. This wasn't mere positive thinking or wishful fantasy. It was a fundamental shift in understanding. Robert moved from identifying with his problems to identifying with his capacity to respond skillfully to those problems. This is what Buddhists call right understanding, the first step of the Noble Eightfold Path. The turning wheel of Dharma Sutra teaches that all conditioned existence is impermanent and that we should strive diligently in our practice. Robert's diligent practice wasn't seated meditation in a monastery. It was the daily choice to see clearly, respond with wisdom, and serve others despite his own pain. Compassion and wisdom in action. What makes Robert's story particularly powerful is that he didn't stop at personal healing. True to the Bodhisattva ideal in Mahayana Buddhism, he dedicated his recovery to helping others. The Bodhisattva vow states that beings are numberless, and I vow to save them all. In the Lotus Sutra, Buddha is compared to a great rain cloud that waters all plants equally, regardless of their size or importance. Robert embodied this principle when he opened his home to children who needed academic and emotional support. He didn't discriminate based on the family's ability to pay or the children's current academic performance. This reflects the Buddhist principle of unlimited loving kindness, or metta. When we extend compassion to others, especially when we ourselves are struggling, we discover that giving and receiving are not separate actions. Robert found that teaching those children helped heal his own grief and gave new meaning to his suffering. Here's a thought-provoking question for you. Some critics say that helping others when you're struggling is just a distraction from dealing with your own problems. Others believe it's the key to healing. Based on your own experience, which perspective feels more true to you? Mindfulness and present moment awareness. Robert's daily 15-minute meditation practice represents another core Buddhist teaching. The Satipatthana Sutta, or Foundations of Mindfulness, describes meditation as the one path for the purification of beings, for overcoming sorrow and grief, for ending suffering and dissatisfaction, for gaining the right path, and for realizing enlightenment. Through meditation, Robert learned to observe his thoughts and emotions without being swept away by them. He realized that feelings of sadness, anger, and fear were temporary mental formations, like clouds in the sky of consciousness. This didn't make these emotions less real, but it prevented them from overwhelming his entire experience. The practice of mindfulness taught Robert the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is often unavoidable. A cancer diagnosis is painful. Losing a spouse is painful. But suffering is the story we tell ourselves about the pain. Suffering is the mental elaboration that turns temporary pain into a permanent identity. In Zen Buddhism, there's a saying, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Robert discovered the truth of this teaching through direct experience, impermanence and acceptance. Perhaps the most fundamental Buddhist teaching illustrated in Robert's story is anicca, or impermanence. Everything changes, everything passes. In the connected discourses, Buddha taught that we should see the world like foam on water, like a mirage. Those who see the world this way cannot be seen by the god of death. Robert learned to see his circumstances as temporary weather patterns in the vast sky of his being. His wife's death was devastating, but the love they shared remained as a permanent part of who he had become. Michael's paralysis was a life-changing challenge, but it didn't define his son's capacity for happiness or contribution. Robert's cancer was serious, but it wasn't the totality of his existence. This understanding of impermanence led to what Buddhists call acceptance, not passive resignation, but active engagement with reality as it is, rather than as we wish it were. From this acceptance, skillful action naturally arises. The middle way in balanced Buddha's teaching of the middle way became Robert's guiding principle. He didn't pretend that his losses weren't painful, nor did he drown in despair. He found the middle path between denial and despair, between spiritual bypassing and emotional overwhelm. The middle way taught Robert that he could fully feel his grief while still choosing hope. He could acknowledge his limitations while still taking action. He could accept help from others while still maintaining his dignity and independence. This balance is reflected in the Buddhist ideal of the householder bodhisattva, someone who pursues enlightenment not by escaping the world, but by engaging with it more skillfully and compassionately. Robert Williams died to his old identity as a victim of circumstances and was reborn as a teacher of wisdom. This is the true meaning of liberation in Buddhist philosophy. Not escape from life's challenges, but freedom within them. As we reflect on Robert's journey, we see that the greatest teachings often come not from books or lectures, but from how we choose to meet life's inevitable difficulties. His story reminds us that we all have the capacity to transform our suffering into wisdom and our personal healing into service to others. The question now is this: how will you apply these timeless teachings to your own life's challenges? What clouds are currently covering your sky? And how might you remember your true nature as the vast, unchanging awareness that observes all passing storms? A final message for your heart. Dear friends, Robert Williams' story is not a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It is the real journey of a real person with real difficulties and real choices about how to respond. Perhaps right now, you are facing your own storm. It might be work pressure, a broken relationship, illness, or simply feeling lost in modern life. I want you to know something. You are stronger than you think. Let me ask you the most important question of today. Please share in the comments. What storm in your life has taught you the most valuable lesson, and what helped you get through it? Buddha never promised us a life without suffering. He taught us how not to become enslaved by suffering. Like Robert, you can choose how to perceive your circumstances. A challenge from heart to heart. I challenge you not to think positively in some mechanical way, but to discover the true nature of who you really are. Are you the difficulties you're currently facing? Or are you the vast consciousness that is experiencing those difficulties? Here's a controversial question that I want you to debate. Some people will say, easy to talk when you're not facing hardship. Anyone can preach when life is good. Do you agree with this perspective? Or do you believe there are principles that apply in any circumstance? Please argue your point in the comments. 3 practical steps starting today. First, meditate for 10 minutes each morning. You don't need complex techniques. Simply sit quietly, observe your breath, and remember that you are the observer of your thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. Second, keep a gratitude journal. Each evening, write down 3 things you're grateful for that day. It could be something small like your morning coffee or something big like your health. Third, practice compassion in action. Each week, do one good deed without expecting anything in return. It could be helping a neighbor or simply listening to a friend who needs to talk. Our channel's commitment, Whispers of Dharma, is committed to bringing you soul-touching stories every week. This isn't just an entertainment channel. It's a place to nourish your spirit where you can find peace in the midst of life's rush. If today's story has touched your heart, here's what I ask of you. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss other spiritual stories. Share this video with a friend who needs some inspiration. Write a comment sharing your own story, because everyone has a valuable lesson to teach others. Next week, I will tell you about a woman who forgave the man who killed her husband and how that act of forgiveness transformed both their lives. Are you curious to know how she was able to do such a thing? Let me know in the comments. The deeper teaching. You see, the real teaching in Robert's story isn't about overcoming cancer or finding new purpose after loss. The deeper teaching is about remembering who you truly are beneath all the temporary circumstances of your life. When Robert sat in that hospital waiting room, broken and defeated, he thought he had lost everything that mattered. His identity as a teacher, his role as a husband, his dreams for his son's future. But young Tommy's simple wisdom about the sky revealed a profound truth. Robert had never lost his essential nature. The clouds of circumstance had simply obscured it temporarily. This is the message I want to leave with you today. Your current problems are not permanent features of your identity. They are temporary weather patterns moving through the vast sky of your being. You are not your job, your relationship status, your bank account, or your health diagnosis. You are the aware presence that observes all of these changing conditions. When you remember this, something extraordinary happens. You stop being a victim of your circumstances and start being a conscious participant in your own transformation. This doesn't mean you won't feel pain or sadness. It means you won't let those feelings define the totality of who you are. A personal invitation. I want to make you a personal invitation. For the next 7 days, I challenge you to practice what Robert learned. When difficulties arise, instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" try asking, "What is this experience trying to teach me?" Instead of thinking, "I can't handle this," try thinking, "I am learning to handle this." Notice what happens when you make this subtle shift in perspective. You might be surprised to discover that you have resources and strength you didn't know you possessed. But here's the most important part. Don't keep this wisdom to yourself. Like Robert opening his home to children who needed help, look for ways to serve others even while you're working through your own challenges. There's something almost magical that happens when we extend compassion to others in the midst of our own struggles. Our own healing accelerates and our sense of purpose deepens. The ripple effect. Robert Williams probably never imagined that his darkest period would become his greatest gift to the world. The classes he taught in his living room, born from his own brokenness, went on to impact hundreds of children and families. His story, shared at conferences and now through this video, continues to inspire people he will never meet. This is how healing works. It's not just personal, it's relational. It ripples outward in ways we can't predict or control. Your willingness to transform your own suffering into wisdom doesn't just benefit you. It becomes a gift to everyone whose life touches yours. So as you face whatever storms are currently in your sky, remember Robert's journey. Remember Tommy's simple wisdom. Remember that you are vast, you are resilient, and you are capable of finding meaning and purpose even in the most challenging circumstances. Your pain has purpose, your struggles have meaning, your healing has the power to heal others. Final words of blessing. Remember, no matter what storm life brings you into, you are still the sky. The storm will pass, But you remain forever vast, forever free. Thank you for spending your precious time listening. See you next week with another story from the world of miracles. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be free from suffering.